This week's video is brought to you by my upcoming manga Amaranth Angels. In a future where humanity is expanding into space, Sai Nishizawa is a starfighter pilot prodigy, flying alongside her big sister and their close friend. However, following a sudden tragedy, Saya only wants to run as far from a cockpit as she can. Fate, however, has other ideas. You can start reading the prologue, which details the events that lead up to Saya's decision on Webtoons now, and you can subscribe to my Patreon to read ahead. It's my contribution to the fun, and frankly underserved, cute girls doing military things genre. We've got cute anime girls flying starfighters in exciting, fast-paced space battles, in service of a great story. God willing, it'll be coming to Kickstarter soon. Now, onto the video. Over the years, a full decade now, since Girls Und Panzer first debuted, there have been plenty of discussions and debates among both fans and people who've just happened upon some clips of the show regarding the quote-unquote realism of Girls Und Panzer, specifically in regard to the all-important tanks, and whether realism is important in regard to how good the show is. There are two aspects to this discussion. First, determining how realistically depicted the tanks and tank battles actually are, and second, the discussion of whether realism is actually required in something like this, and where the line between realism and entertainment should be drawn. Before we get started, here's your standard spoiler warning. I don't expect to mention much plot-related stuff, though the scenes I mention and use clips from will be from all over the place, so beware if you haven't watched the entire show yet. Let's start with the tanks themselves. It's clear to anyone who knows tanks, or who cares to look into things, that the tank models in this show are incredibly accurate to the real thing. From the details on their exteriors to the depictions of the interiors, to the movement of the cannons and the tracks, it's quite clear that there were genuine tank nerds involved in their production. In fact, Girls Und Panzer stands out among tank-related media as one that's very accurate in its depiction of the tanks it uses, and as a show that recreates a wider variety of World War II era tanks than any other property. Part of this is due to it being animated, of course, but another part is the genuine love of the show's creators for historical tanks, where else would you expect to see a realistic depiction of airdrop tanks, if exaggerated in scope a bit. Where the debates and questions really come in is how the tanks are depicted in terms of function. For one, the tanks in the show move more quickly than the real-life versions did, and maneuver more smoothly. Beyond that, of course, people often raise eyebrows, primarily regarding the jumping and drifting of tanks in Girls Und Panzer. Tanks can't do that, they say. Just anime nonsense, they say, often in a derogatory way. However, now, it's not so simple as, all tanks can actually do this, therefore the show is realistic, of course. There's a reason there aren't tons of real-life tanks drifting and jumping, and of course different tanks, especially modern ones, have different capabilities compared to World War II era tanks. But what those short clips do demonstrate is that, at least in theory, tanks can do these things, which adds a layer of plausibility to it all. Also worth noting is something that a lot of people forget or just don't realize. The only real tank drift in the entirety of Season 1 is in the final battle, and, as would probably happen more often than not in real life, the tracks snap. We see far more drifting in Dare Film and beyond, though in Dare Film it's worth noting that all the drifting takes place on smooth stone ground, and after heavy rain that would make it extra slick, and the drifting therefore more viable, at least in theory. The writers and the production team knew just what they were doing. And, while they are stretching things a bit at times, like I mentioned earlier, nearly everything we see the tanks do is within some realm of plausibility, even if it'd be really tough to pull off in real life. It's also no accident that the tank with the most impressive jump in the series is the BT-42. That old clip of a real tank making a big jump? That was a BT-7, a close relative of the BT-42. And Rosehip's Crusader is a close relative of the Cromwell, a tank which is documented to have made a 20-foot or 6-meter jump over water, not unlike what we saw in their film. These are all deliberate, carefully chosen references, and add more strength to the argument that Girls Und Panzer is more realistic than it might seem at first glance. On the other hand, some things in the show are deliberately not realistic, for entertainment's sake, such as the speed of the tanks. Real tanks, especially old ones like these, really weren't fast. While in a strictly historical film or show you'd want to see them move at proper speed, in a show like this, where you want and need faster-paced action, simply upping the speed is a good decision. Additionally, if you really want to dive into this, there is a possible in-universe explanation for them moving as fast as they do, and it ties into the famous hand wave about the tank's safety. That is, these tanks aren't actual historical tanks the girls are using. They're recreations made for Senshiro, with that wonderful carbon coating. You don't think those white flight mechanisms were part of the original designs, do you? Is it such a stretch to say that using more modern materials makes the tanks lighter and therefore faster and easier to do tricks with? Not to mention the fact that modern built recreation engines could easily be much more powerful. However, as fun as it might be to theory craft in-universe explanations for things like this, it really isn't necessary. And this brings us to part 2 of the discussion of realism in Girls Und Panzer. Readers, or viewers of fiction, are very willing to suspend their disbelief, provided a story meets 2 criteria. 1. The story, and especially the less realistic aspects, being entertaining and fun. And 2. The story being internally consistent. As I've already mentioned, all the unrealistic, or borderline realistic, elements of Girls Und Panzer's tank battles are done not just because this is anime so we can do whatever we want, but to ensure that the battles stay fast-paced and exciting for not just the tank nerds watching, but for the rest of the viewers as well. Following from that, as the show continued and moved on to more movie-length productions, it had to up its game. It's just the nature of any piece of entertainment. You can't get stagnant, so you need to innovate and up the ante. So in their film, there were definitely more creative choices taken with the actions, and they were more willing to push the bounds of realism more. And where did that lead? To one of, if not the best, battle scene put to film. Certainly the only example of a nearly uninterrupted, almost hour-long battle that never got boring. But I'll save the rest of my thoughts on their film's main battle for another video, or probably a series of videos. And even when they do push boundaries a bit far in their film, like the little tank roller coaster ride we see, the writers and directors were careful not to push things too far. Tank tricks are, mostly, still relatively grounded, and the Porsche Tiger's souped-up motor took itself out after a couple of seconds, as it probably should have. If they tried to keep all the action in their film especially completely realistic, it certainly wouldn't have been nearly as fun to watch. At the end of the day, Girls Und Panzer is fiction, and it never tries to pass itself off as real. Remember, this is a show where tiny Japanese high school girls can effortlessly load sometimes massive tank rounds. The people who complain about quote-unquote realism in Girls Und Panzer rarely seem to mention that fact, while instead focusing on things that are much more plausible and justifiable. And let's be honest, it's clear what the most unrealistic aspect of the show is. At least according to my brother, who's a former tank driver in real life, and a fan of Girls Und Panzer too. Though not to the same degree as me. The Automotive Club. I've had to listen to him rant about how it's unfair that they're able to repair and maintain their tank so easily, when it was backbreaking labor for him and his crew. Personally, I think he's just a little jealous. All joking aside though, Girls Und Panzer is, first and foremost, a cute girls doing military things show. It makes no claims to being 100% realistic, and doesn't try to be, and it doesn't have to be. What it does do, though, is respect the historical machines it recreates, and it respects its audience. Girls Und Panzer manages to ride the very fine line between keeping things grounded and plausibly realistic, while also ensuring that we get the most exciting and creative tank battles possible. Additionally, the idea that the show's quality level depends on it being completely realistic is just silly. Especially considering that it is an anime, and it could have easily gone completely ridiculous and over the top. But it didn't, precisely because they truly do care about the tanks and their history. People who complain about things not being completely accurate probably wouldn't enjoy the show if the tanks moved at the same speed as in real life, and if we didn't have the creative, fast-paced maneuvers we see so often. While, like I mentioned, Girls Und Panzer makes no claims at being a historically accurate show, it manages to pay much greater respect to these vehicles and their history than most shows that claim to be more historical. Like I touched on earlier, with this show, as with any work of fiction that takes inspiration from history or just uses stuff like historical-based weapons, you need to find the right balance between keeping things believable or realistic and ensuring that this doesn't lessen the story's ability to entertain its audience, since, in the end, that's what matters most. That, along with keeping things consistent with what you just do decide to establish in-universe. Girls Und Panzer manages to ride this narrow line perfectly. History and tank buffs have plenty to geek out over, while the action ensures that a wider audience stays interested and invested. And some of those viewers may become tank nerds as a result. As far as I'm concerned, that's a perfect outcome and I wouldn't have it any other way. If you enjoyed this video and like to support me and what I do here, check out the links to my books and light novels below in the description. A link to my Patreon is down there as well. I've started sharing awesome updates, including completed pages from my upcoming manga Amaranth Angels on there, and there are other rewards too. You can also start reading the prologue for free over on Webtoons. Additionally, I've got cool merch over on TeePublic. And, as always, if you have any thoughts on this video or just anything Girls Und Panzer related you'd like me to talk about, definitely share them below in the comments. I'd love to hear them, and I do my best to read and eventually respond to all of the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future uploads. That's all for now, so until next time.